Modern conservation biology as a scientific discipline got its start in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In this video, we will look at the foundations of this discipline and the modern conservation movement. In particular, we will look at the biocentric philosophies that underpinned early conservation biology and still continue to influence the discipline today. First, let's overview what we mean by biocentrism and how it compares to anthropocentrism. Biocentrism is an ethical point of view that extends intrinsic or inherent value to all living things, no matter what species they belong to. All living creatures have value, no matter what species they belong to, simply because they exist. The foundation of biocentrism is the idea that humans and other species are members of Earth's community, and that all of these species are part of the same system of interdependence. Each species works to pursue their own good in their own unique ways, and none of these pursuits is any better than any other. The crux of the biocentric worldview is that human beings are not inherently superior to any other living being. Approaches to conservation that are rooted in biocentrism prioritize the needs of non-human species, even if it means sacrificing human interests and wants. Michael Soule, the father of modern conservation biology, who we will hear about more in a minute, was a huge proponent of biocentrism, and his view can be summed up in this quote. Quote, "Is the sacrifice of natural productivity, beauty, and diversity prudent, even if some human communities and companies might be enriched? No. The worth of nature is beyond question, and our obligation to minimize its degradation is no less." End quote. The core of his and other biocentrist argument is that as humans we cannot sacrifice the other species we share this planet with just to satisfy our wants. We have to live as responsible members of Earth's biotic community. In contrast, anthropocentrism is a human-centered ethical perspective. With anthropocentrism, human beings are generally the only species that are assigned intrinsic value. We are the only species deemed to have inherent value. Now, there are weaker forms of anthropocentrism where other species are deemed to have intrinsic value, but the key, and what sets it apart from biocentrism, is that humans are deemed to have a higher value than any non-human, so that human interests are privileged at the expense of other species. When conservation takes a more anthropocentric approach, it's usually focused on the benefits that humans receive from nature or ecosystem services. Other species are valued, but only insofar as their utilitarian value to humans. When we talk about anthropocentric approaches to conservation, a name that often comes up is Peter Carewa, who we will hear from in a later video. He sums up his approach to conservation in this quote. Quote, "For me at least, the rights of people for self-determination take supremacy over any species or biodiversity tally. It is my job as a conservation scientist to find the ways that people can indeed come first, and while biodiversity can also be protected." End quote. The core of the anthropocentric argument for conservation is that humans need nature to survive, and our conservation efforts should be focused on those areas that will best contribute to our survival. Now that we understand the difference between biocentrism and anthropocentrism, let's overview the history of modern conservation biology, which, as we will see, has a long history of biocentrism. What we call conservation today has its roots in a 1978 conference that was held in San Diego and organized by Michael Soule, who, as I mentioned earlier, is often referred to as the father of modern conservation biology. With this conference, Soule wanted to discuss the increasingly rapid disappearance of species, the destruction of natural habitats, and the potential solution to these problems. In attendance were evolutionary biologists, ecologists, plant taxonomists, and wildlife biologists, among others. And these folks worked for all kinds of different organizations, including government agencies, universities, NGOs, and zoos. During his keynote address, Soule made an impassioned plea for everyone in the room to come together and use their skills and expertise to save threatened and endangered species from the worst extinction event the planet had seen in 65 million years. His argument was that it was impossible for a responsible biologist to ignore the challenges of conserving natural diversity. He contended that everyone in the room had been drawn to their profession because of their love of the natural world, leading him to ask, how will you study what you love if what you love no longer exists? His argument was simple, that biologists have a duty to save what they love, and therefore need to use their talents and expertise to work towards nature conservation. A big theme of this address and the conference more broadly was that there wasn't time to wait. There was a need for biologists to act immediately and begin to use their knowledge to design nature reserves and determine their appropriate management to maximize habitat and species diversity and minimize the interference from human impacts. The overall goal was to figure out how to manage different individual species populations to maintain their fitness in order to ensure evolutionary potential. What this call to action was really a call for a brand new discipline within biology, what became known as conservation biology. This sense of urgency that was prevalent in the conference and in Soulei's address shaped the early days of conservation biology and really still influences the discipline today. Because of this, conservation is often referred to as a crisis discipline or a discipline with a deadline. Following that conference, Soulei's call to action was taken up by scientists across the United States and around the world, and they began to mobilize, creating the new scientific discipline of conservation biology in the process. This included the forming of the Society for Conservation Biology in 1985, of which Michael Soulé was the first president. Also in 1985, Soulé published what became the seminal paper for this new science of conservation, called What is Conservation Biology? The paper is one of our supplemental readings this week, and throughout it, you can see that sense of urgency that characterized the conservation of the era. It is here that Soulé coins conservation biology as a crisis discipline, and he compares it to medicine where there is often a need to act without all of the facts. Just as surgeons and emergency doctors sometimes have to take quick action to save the life of their patients, without being able to run every test possible, conservation biologists have to act now with whatever information they have to work with in order to save the planet and all of its inhabitants. The key argument is that there isn't time to conduct all of the studies we would want to about the nature of the planet before we can start the serious task of nature conservation. There just simply isn't time to wait for lengthy scientific studies to get all of the information. We have to act now and use the best available knowledge that we have. In this sense, there is a high degree of uncertainty tolerated in conservation compared to other branches of science. And it's not that more exploratory ecological studies are not important, they certainly are. It's just that these studies need to be conducted at the same time as conservation moves forward, and that conservation strategies can always be adjusted as new scientific information becomes available in the future. The key is that there is a great need to just simply start conserving nature now. Another parallel to medicine that Soulé draws in the paper is that conservation biology is an inherently multidisciplinary space. Just like the cancer biologist will combine information from cell biology, immunology, and pharmacology to treat a patient, the conservation biologist will need to draw on genetics, environmental monitoring, physiology, and public policy to work towards the conservation of nature. In this paper, conservation biology is also set apart from other scientific disciplines because of its focus on on-the-ground action rather than the pure pursuit of knowledge. Unlike many other scientific disciplines, conservation biology has an end goal: the saving of Earth's species and the ecosystems they depend on. A key part of Soulei's seminal paper was a set of functional and normative postulates which would go on to shape the direction of conservation biology for a generation. Let's go over these postulates, starting with the functional or mechanistic ones. These are a set of working propositions to underpin conservation action that Soulé developed based on a combination of scientific evidence, theory, and intuition. They are a set of fundamental axioms derived from ecology, biogeography, and population genetics. The first is that many of the species that make up natural communities are the products of coevolutionary processes. We know that many species are dependent on each other and form highly complex ecological systems where each species fills a specialized, unique role in that system. So when one species goes extinct, the entire system is affected because its role is no longer being filled. Some species play such an important and fundamental role in their system that they are what we call a keystone species. The classic example of what can happen when a keystone species is removed from an ecosystem is the case of the wolves of Yellowstone National Park. By 1926, wolves had been completely pushed out of the park by hunters, and the absence of wolves on the landscape led to an explosion of the elk population, who in turn intensively grazed their way across the landscape, killing young brush and trees, which then stunted forest growth and development in many of the park's valleys. And as early as the mid-1930s, or about a decade or so after the last wolf was shot, scientists began to raise concerns about the degradation of the young forests, and they were worried about the effects that this might have on soil erosion. In 1995, wolves were actually reintroduced into Yellowstone, allowing the ecosystem to start to recover from their 70-year absence. Ultimately, the wolves of Yellowstone are viewed as a success story, but reintroductions require a lot of resources that aren't always available, and it is far more prudent to avoid extirpating a species in the first place. The second functional postulate states that many, if not all, ecological processes have thresholds below and above which they become discontinuous, chaotic, or even suspended. Sully made two key assumptions when he proposed this. The first is that in many cases, ecological processes require a large area to function properly. So the larger an area is, the more likely it is that natural systems will be able to function. Think back to our discussions on biogeography and landscape ecology. The more disconnected a habitat patch is from other natural areas, the harder it is for natural processes, things like evolution and species migrations, to operate normally. This assumption led to conservation biology's focus on attempting to secure the largest areas for protection possible. The second assumption here is that when a population of a particular species gets too high or too low, it can have major implications for the rest of the ecosystem. Again, the wolves of Yellowstone offer a really good example. When the wolf population in the region got too low, the elk population was able to climb, eventually leading to the destruction of willow patches and the erosion of the river banks where the willows once stood. The third functional postulate is that genetic and demographic processes have thresholds below which non-adaptive and random forces will begin to prevail over adaptive and deterministic forces within populations. The implication here is that a population's chance of long-term survival are tied to its size. The smaller a population is, the more at risk of inbreeding it is, meaning it is more at risk of losing its genetic diversity and its ability to adapt to future changes, including those that are going to come along with climate change. This is a concern that some scientists have raised about the wolves of Yellowstone. There were just 31 wolves in that initial reintroduction, and while they have developed into multiple packs totaling over 100 animals throughout the park today, their ability to connect with populations outside of the park in order to increase genetic diversity is actually quite low, because while they can't be hunted within the park, they can be shot as soon as they step outside the park boundary. And the area surrounding Yellowstone is still pretty rife with the anti-wolf sentiments that led to the wolf's extirpation in the first place. The final functional postulate offered by Sully in that paper is that nature reserves are inherently disequilibrial for large, rare organisms. There are two key reasons for making this statement. The first is that extinctions are inevitable in small habitat patches, and the more isolated they are, the lower the likelihood that they will be recolonized. Again, think back to our discussions on island biogeography. The smaller and more isolated a habitat patch is, the fewer the species it is likely to hold. The second reason behind this postulate is that speciation will not occur for large organisms in small nature reserves because they're too small to keep a large population over a long period of time. Think back to the graphic that we saw of the wolf-pluies movements over the course of a year and a half. Just one single wolf covered an area of about 100,000 square kilometers. Now think about how much of an area would be needed to sustain a population of 50, 500, or even 5,000 wolves. Small isolated protected areas just simply aren't enough to protect the largest creatures on their own. Again, this postulate led to the goal of conservationists trying to protect the largest area they possibly can, and eventually led to a focus on the connectivity between protected areas, something that we'll look at in a lot more detail later on in this course. Now let's examine the normative or ethical postulates of a biocentric approach to conservation. These are the value statements that underpinned the worldview of conservation biology for its first couple of decades as a discipline. They can provide some standards by which conservation actions can be measured, though it is important to keep in mind that Sully was clear in writing this paper that he never intended for them to be the basis for some sort of ideological purity test. Now, within these statements, we can see the influence of Sully's biocentrism and his stance that all species have inherent or intrinsic value. The first normative postulate is that the diversity of organisms is good. Now, this isn't the type of statement that can be tested or proven, but the general idea is that variety seems to be a good thing. This postulate underpins the primary goal of conservation biology, to protect the diversity of life on Earth and to prevent the extinction of species as that would lower biodiversity. However, Sully stipulated that not all diversity is good, and that natural diversity should be valued over artificial. Therefore, just because humans can increase the biodiversity in an area through the introduction of new species, it doesn't mean that we should. Although this was generally accepted by most conservationists in the 1980s and 1990s, it became more contentious in the 21st century with the rise of the new conservation, which we will look at in more detail in a later video and later throughout this course. The second is that ecological complexity is good. This parallels the first as more complex ecosystems generally have more species, and more diversity is viewed to be as a good thing. Again, like the idea that diversity is good, Sully notes that this postulate must come with a preference for natural systems over artificial ones, or as he put it, wilderness over gardens. He accepts that it is not possible to prove why natural diversity should be the standard for conservation, but he contends that it should be nonetheless. And again, this was a notion that was generally accepted by conservationists in the 20th century, but became more contentious and the source of really bitter debate in the 21st. The next normative postulate is that evolution is good. The idea is that conservation must work to protect the process of evolution because current biodiversity is the product of past evolutionary forces, and future biodiversity will be the product of current evolutionary processes. The final normative postulate is that biotic diversity has intrinsic value, that non-human life has value irrespective of any instrumental or utilitarian value that humans may find with it. As we discussed at the beginning of this video, this is the core of a biocentric worldview, and by including this statement in his paper, Sully tied the foundations of conservation biology to a biocentric worldview. He also viewed this postulate to be the most fundamental of them all. For Sully, this was the fundamental concept that drove conservation action, that non-human life has inherent value that deserves to be protected and defended.